The rain was an afterthought, a pale, lukewarm misery mirroring the state of Elena Mars's soul as she stood on the polished marble floor of the foyer. Less than an hour ago she had been buoyant, a fragile balloon of hope tethered only by a single sheet of embossed medical stationery. Now the paper was crumpled tight in her left hand, a pointless, triumphant flag of a war already lost. Get out, Elena. Now. Hey there, beautiful souls. Welcome back to the channel. I'm so glad you're here with me today for this absolutely incredible story. Before we dive into the story, tell me where in the world you are watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button right now because we've got stories that you won't want to miss. Marcus Maros, her husband of 7 years, stood at the top of the grand staircase, a silhouette of furious, unforgiving judgment framed by the deep mahogany paneling. His voice was a flat, lethal monotone, stripped of all the affectionate warmth that had once made her weak at the knees. It was the voice of a judge delivering a capital sentence, not a husband speaking to the woman who had shared his life, his bed and his dreams, or, as she now realized, his carefully constructed lies. She swallowed the metallic taste of panic. Marcus, please just look at this. You have to see this. It changes everything. She raised her hand, the paper trembling. He didn't move. He didn't even glance at the document that had taken her 6 agonizing months of second opinions, specialist visits and private consultations to secure. The confirmation, stamped and signed by the most renowned reproductive endocrinologist in the city, stated unequivocally that her previous diagnosis of primary ovarian insufficiency had been a monumental error. She was not infertile. She had never been infertile. It changes nothing, Marcus said, his chin rigid. The verdict stands. I told Mother this morning and she agreed. We cannot continue this charade. We need an heir, Elena. A real family. The future. And you cannot give us that. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow, yet they were delivered with such casual cruelty that the sheer injustice overshadowed the pain. He was throwing her out of the house they had built, or rather the house his family had bought, based on a falsehood that she now held the proof to refute. The charade, she thought dimly, was never about her inability to conceive. The charade was the marriage itself. Before she could form a coherent protest, the doors to the library slid open and her mother-in-law, Victoria Maros, swept out. Victoria, always impeccably tailored in severe silk, carried an aura of cold, aristocratic disdain. She didn't look at Elena. She looked at the silver-handled suitcase sitting discreetly by the front door. Marcus has been more than patient, Elena, Victoria announced, her voice pitched just loud enough for the housekeeper and the gardener, who pretended to be trimming non-existent shrubs outside the picture window, to overhear. 7 years of disappointment is quite enough. You will take what belongs to you and leave quietly. The staff has been instructed. Do not make a scene. The shame, hot and acidic, burned Elena's cheeks. Victoria wasn't just confirming the dismissal. She was performing the shaming. This was a public execution of her dignity, a clear signal to their entire social circle that Elena Maros had been found wanting, and had been discarded for her failing. The private pain of her broken marriage was being amplified into a social scandal by the very people who had once welcomed her with open arms. Her eyes met the housekeeper's, a woman named Anna she had known for years. Anna's gaze was quickly averted, a silent confirmation of her new, isolated reality. Elena was no longer mistress of the house. She was an inconvenience, a failed product being returned. They never even asked to see the evidence. The realization was a cold, sinking stone in her gut. They didn't care about the truth. They only cared about the excuse. Gathering every fragment of control she had left, Elena walked toward the suitcase. Her knees were weak but her back was straight. She couldn't afford to crumble here, not under their judgmental, triumphant eyes. She reached for the handle of the small, expensive leather bag, the single piece of luggage allowed for her 7-year existence. It contained 2 changes of clothes, a few essential toiletries and the crumpled, useless paper. I hope you find what you're looking for, Marcus, she said, her voice surprisingly steady, though it felt like shattered glass in her throat. She didn't wait for his reply. There was nothing left to say. The foundation of their life, their future, their trust and their intimacy had been built on the shifting sand of a diagnostic lie. And now, armed with the truth, she had nowhere to turn. She pulled the door open and stepped out onto the wide, covered veranda, then down the steps and onto the slick, rain-dampened paving stones of the driveway. The Morrow's estate, a masterpiece of modern architecture with its sharp lines and cold, imposing glass, was now nothing more than a cage she was finally being ejected from. The rain intensified the moment she walked past the wrought iron gates, a curtain of gray isolating her from the manicured, sterile world she had just left. The street was quiet, lined with towering oaks and the fences of other, equally massive properties. She started walking, the small suitcase dragging over the uneven pavement, the sound an abrasive rhythm against the silence of her despair. The betrayal was total. Marcus had rejected her, the Morrow's family had publicly humiliated her, and the very structure of her life had collapsed. She walked with her head bowed, staring at her sodden leather flats, convinced that the worst betrayal, the deepest, most personal wound, had already been inflicted. She had no idea that betrayal, like fate, was often a three-act play. Across the street, parked discreetly beneath the dense canopy of an old maple tree, a dark, unmarked sedan idled. The rain sluiced over the windshield, but the occupant, a man named Victor Halavai, had his wipers off, relying instead on a quiet intensity of focus. Victor was not a typical resident of this neighborhood of bankers, surgeons, and old money. He was an outsider, a ghost in the machine of high finance, known, if he was known at all, only to those whose fortunes or misfortunes he managed. He dealt in contracts, in leverage, and in the meticulous, almost surgical execution of long-term strategy. He was a man who rarely, if ever, involved himself in the messy, melodramatic affairs of domestic life. Yet he had been waiting here for nearly an hour. His eyes, the color of gunmetal and just as hard, followed Elena's slow, rain-soaked progress. He watched as she paused beneath a streetlight, hunching her shoulders against the cold, wet air. He saw the way she clutched the crumpled paper in her hand, but he didn't need to read it. He already knew its contents and the contents of the original falsified report. Victor Halavai already knew Marcus Morrow's most shameful secret. He knew the extent of his ambition, the depth of his desperation, and the carefully hidden transaction that had led to his recent improbable success. A sudden promotion at the investment bank, a remarkably clean security check, and access to capital that a man of Marcus's true abilities should never have touched. The truth was that Marcus Morrow's life, his career, and his very marriage had become a leveraged commodity, a placeholder in a much larger, more dangerous game involving global finance, illicit power structures, and the succession rights of a criminal enterprise. Victor didn't look at Elena with sympathy and certainly not with lust. He studied her with the focused, dispassionate gaze of an engineer examining a crucial moving part. Her distress was a variable, her rejection was a catalyst, and the fragile, waterlogged woman walking away from the Morrow's house was not a victim but a keystone. He knew that everything Marcus had done, the diagnosis, the distance, the public shaming, was a deliberate, calculated move to sever Elena from a power she didn't know she possessed. And Marcus had just completed the execution phase of a plan that Victor had spent months monitoring, waiting for the precise moment to intervene. Now was the moment. The asset was moving. The plan was activated. Victor reached forward and turned the ignition off. The silence in the car was immediate and profound, broken only by the persistent drum of the rain. He opened the door, stepped out into the downpour and pulled his overcoat tighter around him. Elena was just reaching the corner, her silhouette blending with the gray evening light, utterly alone and convinced she had reached the bottom of her despair. She had no idea that her true story was about to begin, and that the man striding across the street toward her was about to use her rejection not as a tragedy, but as the perfect piece of leverage. Elena Morrows didn't hear the car door close over the steady drumming of the rain. Her focus was entirely on the wet pavement, the drag of the suitcase, and the internal monologue of shame and disbelief playing on an endless loop. She had walked for 10 minutes, but in that time she hadn't processed a single thought about where she was going, only that every step was taking her further from the nightmare of the Morrow's house. A shadow fell over her, cutting through the diffused light of the nearest street lamp. She stopped, startled, and finally lifted her gaze. Standing directly in front of her, framed by the pouring rain and the oppressive silence of the residential street, was a man unlike anyone she had ever encountered in Marcus's polished, predictable social circles. He was tall, powerfully built, yet moved with a quiet, almost dangerous economy. He wore a heavy, dark overcoat that looked perfectly dry despite the downpour, and his hair, the color of wet obsidian, was slicked back, accentuating the severe angles of his face. His features were sharp, chiseled, and utterly devoid of expression. His eyes, fixed on hers, held a metallic indifference that was profoundly unsettling. They weren't judging her but assessing her, as if she were a mathematical problem he was about to solve. Elena's immediate instinctive reaction was to pull her wet jacket tighter around her, feeling suddenly exposed, miserable, and profoundly vulnerable. "I don't need anything," she mumbled, already trying to step around him. She assumed he was a solicitor, perhaps hired by Marcus to deliver some final, humiliating paperwork, or even a local resident annoyed by her presence. The man didn't move. He simply stared, his gaze sweeping over her rain-soaked frame, the expensive but waterlogged clothes, and the telltale suitcase. He registered her state, the shock, the lingering grief, the damp chill, but offered no hint of compassion or warmth. Then Victor Halavai spoke. His voice was deep, resonant, and carried a subtle, almost imperious accent Elena couldn't immediately place. It was the sound of authority rarely questioned. "Come with me." The two words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Elena felt a fresh wave of humiliation wash over her. This is it, she thought. This is the inevitable next step in my public downfall. She immediately conjured a dozen scenarios. Was he a private investigator hired by Victoria Maros to ensure she wasn't hiding assets? Was he debt collector, aware of some secret financial entanglement Marcus had concealed? Or was he simply a man who saw a woman alone and desperate, offering a sinister form of help? "I don't know you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I am not going anywhere with you." "You have nowhere else to go," Victor countered, his statement not a question but a simple, observable fact. "Your bank accounts are frozen. Your credit cards were deactivated 20 minutes ago. The only person you could call is your sister, who lives 3,000 miles away and is expecting twins. You will be on the street within the hour, Elena." Her breath caught in her throat. How could he possibly know that? Marcus had moved swiftly, ruthlessly, but for her financial access to be cut off so completely, so quickly, it was terrifying. She realized the rejection had not just been an emotional severing, but a strategic total incapacitation. "Who are you?" she demanded, dropping the suitcase handle. He ignored the question, his focus remaining razor-sharp. "The Maros family has painted you as the infertile, inconvenient wife. That narrative is already set. If you call the police, you will be seen as hysterical. If you call a friend, you will be seen as a beggar. Your only option is to vanish for a while." Victor took a single controlled step closer, and for the first time, Elena felt the raw, unadulterated power emanating from him. It was a power that wasn't flashy or loud. It was the quiet confidence of a predator who knows he controls every variable in the environment. "I am not offering you solace, Elena. I am offering you leverage," he said, the word pronounced with a chilling financial precision. "You can stand here in the rain and try to fight a public narrative that has already been written by powerful people. Or you can step into my car, disappear, and gain the time, the resources, and the protection you will need to rewrite it." This was not a rescue. It was a contract negotiation conducted on a wet street corner. And yet she was drawn to the terrifying, pragmatic logic of his offer. Every instinct screamed danger, but every rational thought confirmed his assessment of her desperate situation. Marcus had ensured she was utterly stranded. She looked past him, back toward the Maros estate. The lights were on, the house cold and indifferent. She imagined Victoria already making calls, spinning the story, cementing her disgrace. She knew with chilling certainty that if she stayed here she would lose everything: her dignity, her future, and any chance of exposing Marcus's lie. "What do you want?" she finally asked, the question laced with suspicion and fear. "There is always a price." Victor's gaze didn't waver. His study of her intensified. And this was the moment Elena did not see the calculation that truly drove him. It was not the predatory hunger of a man seeking a mistress or a sexual conquest. It was the intense, detached focus of a master chess player who has just spotted the one piece that, when moved, will expose his opponent's king. He saw her pain, yes, but he also saw her genetic lineage, the subtle details of her maiden name, the connections forged decades ago, and the massive, unseen legal consequences of her confirmed fertility. To Victor, Elena was not a person to be desired but a missing piece. a key to unlocking a financial and political structure that had been locked against him for years. She was the one unavoidable biological factor that made a much larger global puzzle finally complete. "The price is your silence, your cooperation and your patience," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "For a time you belong to the narrative I choose to create. You will be safe. You will be provided for. You will not be touched. Do we have an agreement?" He held out his hand. It was a formal gesture, an offer to shake on the deal, not an attempt to help her up. Elena stared at the large, pale hand, then at his impassive face. She could hear the distinct sound of a distant vehicle approaching. The neighborhood security patrol, perhaps, or just another resident. Her time was running out. She had been rejected twice this morning, by her body's false history and by her husband's cruel deception. Now she was being offered a stark, terrifying alternative by a man who made no pretense of mercy or kindness. He had offered her 2 words of direction, nothing more. If she said no, she sank into the cold, public mire of her ex-husband's lies. If she said yes, she stepped into a world defined by leverage, contracts, and long-buried, dangerous truths. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that did little to warm her, Elena finally made the choice that fear and necessity dictated. She did not take his hand. Instead, she bent down, picked up her suitcase, and walked past him toward the idling sedan she now noticed a few feet away. "Drive," she said, her voice strained but clear. She got into the warm, leather-scented interior of the car without looking back. Victor watched her settle, then followed her into the car, his movements as fluid and silent as a shadow. He didn't offer comfort or even confirmation of their destination. He simply pulled the door shut, isolating them from the storm. As the car pulled away from the curb and vanished into the wet gloom, Elena leaned her head back against the luxurious seat, the tension in her body slowly giving way to a bone-deep exhaustion. She was running not toward freedom but toward a calculated risk. She had given up her personal crisis for a strategic one, unaware that her choice had placed her directly in the crosshairs of a conflict far older and more lethal than her broken marriage. She had nowhere else to go, and Victor Halavai had known that all along. The estate was a study in severe, unapologetic modernism, a structure of glass, steel and dark, imported stone that sat high on a private ridge, overlooking the distant, glittering sprawl of the city. It felt less like a home and more like an observatory or a fortified corporate headquarters. When the car arrived, Elena was guided not into the main residence, but to a separate, beautifully articulated wing that seemed to have been designed for maximum solitude. Her new quarters consisted of a private suite, a vast bedroom, a minimalist sitting room, and a spa-like bathroom, all connected to a small, contained garden courtyard by floor-to-ceiling sliding glass doors. A woman named Anya, the estate's head of household, was the only person she interacted with upon arrival. Anya was efficient, quiet, and carried herself with the kind of professional detachment Elena had only ever seen in high-level private security. "Mr. Halavai's instructions are precise, Ms. Morrows," Anya said, her voice low and even as she placed a set of heavy magnetic keys on a marble counter. "This wing is yours entirely. You have full autonomy here. Meals will be delivered at scheduled times, or you may request them at your convenience. You may also access the inner grounds of the estate." Elena listened, waiting for the catch, the contract clause, the list of demands. And the catch? "What do I have to do?" Anya met her gaze, her expression unreadable. "You are required to recover. To rest. To take advantage of the quiet. And there is one rule, madam. A strict one that must be observed by all staff and by you. Which is, no one is permitted to mention, discuss, or inquire about your previous marriage, the Morrows family, or the circumstances of your departure. That part of your life is considered concluded." Elena blinked, utterly confused. Concluded. The rule wasn't about control or secrecy. It was about imposing a vacuum. She had expected to be cross-examined, leveraged, perhaps even threatened. Instead, she was being given a silent, inviolable space to simply exist, with the entire agonizing subject of her recent trauma declared strictly off-limits. It felt less like a prison rule and more like an extreme, clinical form of quarantine. For the next few days, Elena did as she was told. She slept. She stared out at the rain-streaked city. She took long, hot baths and wore the neutral, expensive clothes that had been placed, perfectly folded, in the custom cedar closet. The grief and exhaustion began to recede, leaving a stark, clear-eyed confusion in their wake. The house was not a prison. The doors were not locked, she tested them. She could step out into the inner garden courtyard, which was ringed by a high wall, yet that wall felt more like a barrier against the outside world than a cage designed to hold her in. The staff treated her with a respectful distance, anticipating her needs. A coffee, a book, a fresh towel, before she even voiced them, but their manner was not servile. It was protective. It was this unnerving professional respect that first chipped away at her assumptions. She was not being treated like a mistress, a guest, or a hostage. She was being treated like an asset of extreme value. One afternoon, while browsing the pristine leather-bound books in the sitting room, a collection that seemed curated less for literature and more for strategy, history, and global economics, she found a plain, embossed folder tucked inside a desk drawer. It was an inventory list of the furniture and art pieces in her wing, likely placed there for the insurance provider. The document listed her as the designated occupant. But it did not use the name Elena Maros. Across the top, in bold, stark lettering, was her legal birth name, Elena Petrova. The sight of her maiden name, a name she hadn't used officially in 7 years, was a shock. It wasn't a mistake, it was a preparation. It meant that Victor Halavai, or whoever was running this meticulous operation, had prepared her space before she was Elena Maros' rejected wife. They had prepared it for Elena Petrova, a woman whose previous identity had been intentionally erased. The entire file was predated from nearly a month prior to her husband throwing her out. The realization settled in her gut like cold iron. This was not an impulsive rescue. She was not a distressed woman Victor had decided to help out of convenience. She was a retrieval. The staff's quiet respect began to make a terrible kind of sense. When she asked Anya for a specific, obscure reference book related to maritime law, a topic Marcus had briefly worked on, Anya didn't have to search. She knew exactly where it was and produced it within minutes. The staff wasn't there to cater to a pampered wife. They were there to manage a crucial, high-priority entity, ensuring her comfort and stability so she could transition from one state to another. Later that week, Elena decided to test the boundaries. After a few days of watching the routines, she waited for the night shift change and quietly tried the exterior door that led to the service corridor, half expecting an alarm to sound or a guard to materialize. Instead, the door opened silently onto a short, brightly lit hallway leading to the main house. She cautiously walked a few steps, her senses on high alert. She heard the soft thunk of a pressure-sealed door closing behind her and then silence. When she reached the end of the corridor, she stopped at a window overlooking the expansive outer perimeter. What she saw was not a fence designed to keep her in, but a comprehensive, multi-layered security system designed to keep the world out. Infrared sensors, motion-activated lighting, and the distinct, silent movement of armed patrols, all focused outward. This was not a gilded cage, it was a shield. And someone or something was considered enough of a threat to warrant this level of protection for her. Just as she was about to retreat, a voice spoke from the shadows behind her, calm and utterly expected. "The perimeter is secure, Elena. You should not test it unnecessarily." Victor Halavai stepped into the light, dressed in black slacks and a simple dark turtleneck. He looked less formidable in the casual attire, but his authority was palpable. "Why am I here, Victor?" she asked, turning to face him. She used his first name for the first time in act of defiance. "What am I to you? I am not a business associate and I am certainly not a romantic interest. What did I do to warrant this level of protection?" He paused, studying her with the same detached intensity as he had on the street. He seemed to appreciate the shift in her demeanor, the despair replaced by intellectual curiosity and an emerging flinty resolve. "You are here because you are the center of a transaction that Marcus Maros initiated and then botched," Victor stated, walking slowly toward a massive satellite map of the city displayed on the wall. "He removed you from his life using a lie, believing that by making you infertile and discarded he neutralized you. He was wrong." He tapped a point on the map, a complex grid near the financial district. "Marcus was rewarded for your removal. His promotion, his cleared debts. It was a payment for severing a bloodline that interfered with the succession. You did not know you carried this influence. But others did. And when you walked out with that piece of paper confirming the original diagnosis was false, you became the single most dangerous living threat to that succession." "My fertility is dangerous?" she repeated, the irony staggering. Your biological status is now a massive, undeniable point of leverage in a financial war, Victor corrected. Marcus believed his shame was your infertility. His true shame is his treachery. Your worth to me is not your body but your legal potential. And until that potential is realized or neutralized by my hand, multiple factions would prefer you gone. He turned back to her, his gaze finally softening, but only marginally, like the brief flicker of heat from a deep-sea vent. The house is not a prison, Elena. It is a bunker. I do not require your love or your gratitude. I require your existence. And for the moment, that existence must be absolute and undisturbed. Your job is to regain your strength. Because very soon, you will be moved from a position of defense to a position of offense. The moment to use the leverage is approaching. He gave her a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a dismissal or perhaps a warning. Go back to your wing, Elena. Rest. And prepare yourself for the kind of game Marcus Maros could never have played. He left as silently as he had arrived, leaving Elena alone in the vast, quiet space. She walked slowly back to her secluded wing, the key to her autonomy heavy in her hand. The shock was gone, replaced by a cold, building rage. She wasn't an accident. She wasn't a victim. She was a retrieved weapon. And the man who retrieved her did not intend to let her rust. The betrayal was no longer just personal. It was political, biological, and strategic. The Maros family had not just broken her heart. They had tried to erase her significance. And for the first time since she left the Maros house, Elena felt a purpose bloom hot and fierce beneath her fear. While Elena was moving through the clinical solitude of Victor Halavai's estate, believing she was the primary victim of her own crisis, Marcus Maros was basking in the golden, artificial glow of his newly elevated status. The parallel scenes unfolded across the city. Elena was analyzing floor plans and security protocols. Marcus was accepting accolades and closing deals he had no business negotiating. 3 weeks after Elena's swift and unceremonious departure, Marcus was celebrated at a discreet, black-tie event hosted by his investment banking firm, Ethelred Capital. His promotion to executive vice president of emerging markets was not just swift, it was improbable. Emerging markets was a division historically reserved for seasoned partners with decades of proven, unblemished success. Marcus was 38, moderately competent, and until recently had been buried under a mountain of personal debt stemming from several reckless, private ventures. At the event, Marcus stood beside his mother Victoria, who wore an expression of severe, satisfied vindication. My son is finally getting the recognition he deserves, Victoria announced to a group of influential associates, her voice cutting through the polite murmur of the room. It was necessary to clear away the distractions, wasn't it, Marcus? To focus on the lineage. Marcus smiled tightly, a practiced, handsome curve of the lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. Absolutely, mother. Total focus. Ethelred sees the future, and I am now positioned to deliver. The irony was that the only reason Marcus was able to deliver was due to a staggering infusion of capital and a meticulous digital scrubbing of his past. A private investigation firm operating under a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands had discreetly settled his outstanding personal loans and ensured that all records of a minor youthful criminal infraction, embezzlement of a client's minor trust fund, were permanently purged from state and federal databases. He now had a cleared record and a net worth that made him an ideal, untarnished candidate for the EVP role. It became chillingly clear that Marcus's accusation of Elena's infertility was not based on ignorance or genuine belief in the diagnosis. It was a deliberate, premeditated act of removal. He hadn't just wanted a divorce. He needed Elena gone and silenced immediately before she could produce a child that would legally interfere with a chain of succession he was desperate to join. Her emotional dependency and isolation, fostered by the false diagnosis, had made her the perfect, quiescent subject for this disposal. The removal had been calculated to sever Elena from something she did not know she carried. A biological key to a massive generational inheritance, the details of which were only known to the highest echelons of organized finance. The illusion of Marcus's triumphant success lasted exactly 2 more days. He was in his newly renovated corner office, overlooking the very same skyline that Elena watched from Victor's estate. He was celebrating a minor win, a deal in Budapest, when his personal assistant informed him that Mr. Victor Halavai was waiting to see him. No appointment had been made. Marcus froze. Victor Halavai was not a man one simply saw. He was a man whispered about in hushed tones, a myth of global liquidity and untouchable influence, the alleged financier behind certain successful, yet morally ambiguous corporate takeovers. To see him here in his office was like having the devil appear to collect on a promise. "Send him in," Marcus commanded, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. He quickly smoothed his tie, adjusted the framed photograph of his parents, and sat rigidly behind his massive mahogany desk. Victor entered the office alone. He did not bother with pleasantries or handshakes. He moved with the focused gravity of a celestial body, drawing all the light and attention toward himself. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, and his stillness was far more intimidating than any aggression. He stood before Marcus's desk, not sitting, asserting an immediate and definitive hierarchy. "Morrows," Victor stated, his voice quiet, almost bored. "Mr. Halavai, to what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Marcus managed, a tremor in his voice he desperately tried to suppress. Victor didn't answer the question directly. Instead, he pulled a simple, heavy manila envelope from the inner pocket of his coat and placed it precisely in the center of Marcus's desk blotter. "The promotion, Marcus. The cleared debt. The newly expanded life insurance policy your firm took out on you last week," Victor listed, ticking the points off with the same flat, unemotional tone he had used with Elena in the rain. "You believe you earned this, yes?" Marcus swallowed hard. "I worked for it, of course. My dedication to the firm." Victor cut him off with a subtle, dismissive wave of his hand. "Your success was rented. The capital you accessed, the Petrova Trust funds, were released to Ethelred on the express condition that the sole surviving biological heir to the main line, Elena Petrova, was neutralized from having any claim or influence." Marcus's face went pale. The name Petrova hit him harder than any physical threat. He had always known Elena came from old money, but her family had been silent, seemingly isolated. He had been told by the unseen operators that her biological influence was tied to a dead branch that needed to be pruned. "She was infertile," Marcus whispered, the lie now sounding pathetic and hollow even to his own ears. "No, Marcus. She was removed based on a falsified medical document," Victor corrected, his eyes fixing Marcus with a lethal intensity. "A piece of paper she now possesses confirming the fraud. You were paid to execute a separation based on a lie you knew was false. Your job was to keep her quiet, broken, and isolated." Victor finally gestured to the envelope on the desk. "Open it." Marcus looked up, his breathing shallow. His successful life, the one he had just executed his wife to achieve, was disintegrating before his eyes. "It's slander," he stammered. "It's inadmissible." Victor leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the desk. He didn't raise his voice, yet the authority in the room became absolute. "This is not a threat of violence, Morrows. This is an announcement of exposure," Victor said. "Your success was rented and the lease required Elena's silence. You failed. She is no longer silent. She is no longer isolated. And she is most certainly not infertile." He straightened up, brushing a microscopic piece of dust from his sleeve. "The capital you received was a down payment on a permanent transaction. That transaction is now void. The proof of your treachery is now in the hands of those who stand to lose billions if Elena is allowed to claim her rightful position. They will not resort to crude violence. They will use the documents in that envelope to strip you of everything. The job, the money, the reputation, until you are not simply broken but invisible." Victor paused at the door, delivering the final, crushing sentence. "Your success was your reward for severing her from her power. But because of your failure to ensure her final silence, I now have the leverage to not only claim her, but to repossess everything you thought you gained. The lease has expired, Marcus. And the collateral is due." The door closed softly behind Victor, leaving Marcus Morrows alone, staring at the evidence of his deliberate malice and his spectacular failure. The grand corner office suddenly felt cold, claustrophobic, and entirely unsecured. He had thrown away his real marriage for a lie, only to find that the rewards of that lie were temporary and now belonged to the only man who knew the whole devastating truth. 3 days after Victor's chilling confrontation with Marcus, Elena was summoned from her solitary wing to the main library, a circular room lined with towering bookshelves and dominated by a huge polished table of dark quartz. She had finished recuperating. Now she was ready for the facts. Victor was waiting for her. He did not ask how she was or if she had enjoyed her mandated rest. He simply indicated a chair and placed a slim, encrypted tablet in front of her. "The period of stabilization is over, Elena," Victor began, his voice businesslike. "We must now discuss the true terms of your existence over the last 7 years. I promised you the truth. It is not compassionate, but it is necessary." He initiated the tablet. The screen immediately displayed a complex organizational chart, focusing on a shadowy network of offshore companies. At the apex was a holding group, and flowing down from it were lines connecting to real estate trusts, mineral extraction operations, and, centrally, a private healthcare conglomerate specializing in bespoke high-end diagnostics. "Your original infertility diagnosis, primary ovarian insufficiency, was administered at the Petaluma Clinic 7 years ago," Victor stated. "A clinic recommended by your mother-in-law, Victoria Maros, correct?" Elena nodded slowly, her stomach tightening with a cold dread. "Yes." She insisted on a discreet, private facility. "I was grieving and I didn't question it. That clinic is wholly owned by the third-tier holding company you see highlighted," Victor continued, tapping the screen. The name flashed: Ethelred Private Ventures, Subsidiary 7. This subsidiary reports directly to the same people who recently promoted Marcus and wiped his financial slate clean. Elena stared at the illuminated link. The web of deceit was far more vast than she had ever imagined. Her personal tragedy was merely an entry point on a corporate balance sheet. "The lie was never about your body, Elena," Victor asserted, his voice cutting through her shock. "It was about control, inheritance, and isolation. The Petrov family, your biological lineage, is one of the oldest and most discreet power brokers in global finance, a power structure that the Maros family has coveted for generations." He explained that the Petrov legacy was not simple land or liquid cash, but a specific ironclad legal claim to the governance rights of a vast private financial system, the very system that the shadowy backers of Ethelred Capital were trying to usurp. The succession of those rights was biologically tied. They passed only to the first direct, legitimate child of the main Petrov line. "Your father, your last living relative, died 7 years ago, just before your diagnosis," Victor explained. "Had you conceived then, your child would have been the legal heir and would have instantly complicated the Maros' carefully laid plans. They couldn't allow a child to exist, because a child meant power passing through you, to the next generation, rather than being seized by default through the Maros' financial maneuverings." Elena felt the room spinning. Her entire marriage, the pity, the silent sympathy from Marcus, the forced quietude of her grief, had been a perfectly executed 7-year-long act of social and emotional engineering. The lie was so comprehensive that she had internalized it, believing her deepest flaw was biological, not that she was married to a self-serving fraud. Victor then pushed the crucial document across the table. It was the same paper she had clutched in the rain, the conclusive, certified second opinion. "When you secured this, confirming your fertility, you unintentionally initiated a catastrophic chain reaction," Victor said. "You invalidated 7 years of manipulation and reinserted yourself into the succession line. Marcus, in his panic, tried to expedite your removal before this document could be made public. He thought that by throwing you out and shaming you he could render the truth irrelevant." Elena reached for the tablet again, her fingers tracing the connections between the diagnosis, the clinic, and the overarching corporate structure. The scale of the betrayal transformed her personal agony into a cold, terrifying fury. The grief she had carried for years was suddenly transmuted into potent, clear-eyed rage. "They didn't just break my heart," she said, her voice low and steady. "They stole my ability to choose. They stole my future and forced me to grieve a life I was always capable of having." "Exactly," Victor confirmed. "They forced you into a mold, the barren, discarded wife. You were never powerless, Elena. You were simply unaware of the magnitude of your influence. And they wanted you neutralized before that influence could ever manifest." The realization hit her with the force of an awakening. The Maros family hadn't been acting out of emotional cruelty. They were acting out of financial necessity. And they had underestimated the inherent strength that came from surviving a trauma that wasn't real. She looked up at Victor, the confusion finally gone from her eyes, replaced by a terrible resolve. "The document I have, does it expose the entire network or just the clinic?" she asked, no longer a victim, but an interrogator seeking tactical intelligence. "It exposes the falsification of the diagnosis, which invalidates Marcus's grounds for separation. This, in turn, invalidates the terms under which the Ethelred Group accessed the Petrov Trust funds," Victor explained. "It is the legal trigger, the first domino." Elena closed the tablet and pushed it away. She placed her hands flat on the cold quartz table, grounding herself in the reality of her newfound power. "They used to lie about my body to control my life," she said, her voice rising with a controlled intensity. "I want that lie used to destroy everything Marcus built on it. Everything. I want the exposure to be public, legal, and absolute." Victor finally allowed a sliver of something that might have been approval to cross his severe face. "That, Elena, is the definition of leverage," he said. "And I am quite adept at applying it." The revelation had not shattered her. It had annealed her. Elena Maros, the grieving wife, was gone. Elena Petrova, the woman who had survived 7 years of calculated deception, was ready to fight for the future that had been stolen from her. The field was set, and for the first time she was holding the key piece of evidence that could blow the entire criminal succession wide open. The morning after the library confrontation, Elena felt the shift in power acutely. She had demanded the truth, and Victor had given it to her. A truth so devastating it had forged her spirit into something resilient and cold. Now she was ready for the final and perhaps most terrifying piece of the puzzle: Victor's true motivation. She found him in the estate's tactical center, a room that looked more like a global trading floor than a private study, filled with bank of monitors displaying flashing currency rates, complex stock charts, and satellite imagery. He was on a private call, speaking in rapid, hushed Russian, his tone one of absolute, non-negotiable command. He terminated the call abruptly as she entered. "You have questions," he stated, turning to face her, his expression guarded. "Ask them now, Elena. We cannot proceed with the next phase until we are operating under full transparency." Elena walked toward the main display, which currently showed a detailed diagram of a corporate structure she didn't recognize, overlaid with lines marking jurisdictional boundaries. "You didn't intervene out of benevolence or even curiosity," she began, her voice steady. "You knew Marcus was being paid to remove me because my fertility interfered with the succession. But why does my biological status benefit you? You have access to wealth and power. You are Victor Halavai. You are a financier of organized crime if the whispers are true. Why waste your leverage on a broken woman?" Victor watched her, a subtle, almost approving flicker in his eyes. She was no longer afraid of the ugly truth. She was hunting for the crucial variable. He finally sat down, indicating the massive screen with a remote. "The whispers are largely accurate," he conceded, his bluntness disarming. "I am involved in the liquidity of several major criminal enterprises. More specifically, I manage the wealth and legitimate fronts for the Krulov Syndicate, a power base that operates far above the police and governments, you know." He pointed to the screen. "The people who promoted Marcus and funded the falsified diagnosis are rivals, a group known as the Osman faction. Their goal is to claim the Petrov Trust's governance rights. Why? Because the trust is not just money. It is the legal title to the mechanisms that control the global movement of illicit capital, the very arteries of this syndicate." Victor then delivered the most shocking revelation of all. The founder of the Krulov Syndicate, the man who built it from a regional power into a continental giant, was my grandfather. And the structure of the syndicate is intertwined with the Petrov bloodline through a contract established 80 years ago, a binding pact known as the Succession Accord. Elena stepped back, suddenly understanding the terrifying scope of her situation. She wasn't just caught between a husband and a shadowy financier. She was the central pin in a war between two vast, hostile, and utterly ruthless criminal empires. The accord states that if the direct, legitimate male heir of the Petrov line produces a child, that child, regardless of gender, will inherit the legal oversight of the trust's governing mechanisms. The trust controls the conduits, Elena, and the conduits control the flow of all our money. He paused, letting the magnitude sink in. For decades, the Osman faction has been trying to claim those conduits. They believed that because your father died without a son, and because they had successfully neutralized you with a fertility lie, the governing rights would default to their control through a prearranged merger clause. Victor then looked directly into her eyes, the truth as cold and hard as his gaze. I did not intervene out of compassion, Elena. I intervened because your biological child, if you ever had one, would legally disrupt the transfer of power to my rivals. Your fertility is the single greatest threat to the Osman faction's succession plan, and conversely, it is my only legal defense against their takeover. I needed you retrieved, stable and confirmed fertile. You are not a woman, you are an unavoidable biological contract clause. Elena felt a tremor of pure existential fear. She was not powerless as she had always assumed, she was dangerously, lethally important. Multiple factions wanted her neutralized before that danger, the potential for an heir, could manifest. Her marriage was just a footnote in this centuries-old criminal succession war. So you are not my savior, she said, her voice strained. I am your current protector, Victor corrected. My interest is self-preservation, which aligns with yours for the moment. My power comes from my assets, and right now, you are the most critical asset I possess. The moment you step outside this perimeter, you are no longer a person to them. You are a problem that needs to be solved with extreme prejudice. She walked the perimeter of the tactical room, gathering her composure. The initial shock had given way to a profound sense of self-agency. They had tried to make her small and dependent. They had succeeded only in making her dangerous. You say I am an asset, she countered, stopping to face him. A piece of leverage in a succession war. But I am not an object to be stored until needed. This is my life, my body, and the truth of my future that you are protecting. You brought me back to power, Victor, whether you intended to or not. She took a deep breath, planting her feet firmly. You may require my existence, but I require agency. I demand a role in the decisions being made about my life, my leverage, and the downfall of the people who stole 7 years from me. I will not be merely a biological contract clause. If I am the weapon, I will control the aim. Victor was silent for a long moment, studying her transformed demeanor, the subtle tilt of her chin, the steel in her voice. He saw not the grieving wife, but the inheritor of a powerful, ruthless lineage that she was only now beginning to claim. You are demanding to be moved from the safe zone to the strategy table, Victor observed, a flicker of genuine respect in his eyes. I am demanding to be treated as a partner, not collateral, Elena countered. You need this leverage to survive this war. I am the leverage. Therefore you need me to be engaged, informed and active. If I'm going to disrupt a Mafia succession, I need to know the next move. A faint smile touched the corners of Victor's mouth, a gesture as rare as it was unnerving. He stood up, stepping around the quartz table, and extended his hand toward a chair opposite his. Welcome to the chessboard, Elena Petrova, he said, his voice carrying the authority of final acceptance. Let us discuss the exposure of Marcus Maros. You will orchestrate the narrative. I will supply the necessary instruments of destruction. The alliance between Elena and Victor was strictly transactional, yet fiercely effective. Their daily meetings were held in the tactical center, where the discussion revolved around legal strategy, financial pressure points, and the art of controlled exposure. Elena, drawing on her years spent navigating the complex, often cruel social politics of the city's elite, proved to be a far more insightful strategist than Victor's standard team of heavily armed men and financial analysts. She understood the psychology of shame. We cannot use violence or overt criminal action, Elena instructed, standing over the map that now detailed Marcus's corporate connections. That is Victor's territory, and it only validates the Maros family's narrative that I am now associated with criminals. We must use legal, social, and financial traps that force Marcus to expose his own greed and paranoia. Victor listened, silent and watchful. He admired the cold precision of her thinking. She was not seeking crude revenge. She was seeking systemic dismantling. The first move focused on the foundation of Marcus's rise, his cleaned criminal record. Elena, utilizing the documentation Victor provided, the notarized confession from the clinic physician and the genuine fertility report, had Victor's lawyers initiate a lawsuit. The suit was filed in 2 jurisdictions simultaneously. A family court petition challenging the validity of the divorce based on fraudulent diagnosis, citing the clinic and Victoria Maros as co-conspirators, and a civil suit against Marcus for intentional infliction of emotional distress and financial incapacitation. The genius of the move was the timing. The civil suit named Marcus as the sole defendant, but the discovery phase immediately requested all financial records related to his recent promotion, his loan settlements, and any capital transfers linked to Ethelred Capital. This was the pressure point. Marcus will panic and try to shield the financial records, Elena predicted, pacing the room. He won't want to expose the source of his money. We need to force his hand before he can execute a clean transfer of funds out of Ethelred. Victor nodded, his role defined. Supply the instruments. He didn't use a gun, he used liquidity. Victor's operatives, acting through a clean, legitimate fund, quietly initiated a series of high-volume, aggressive stock purchases related to Ethelred Capital, creating a synthetic rally. This forced Marcus's superiors to prioritize stability over secrecy, requiring immediate, transparent reports on all transactions, including the mysterious capital infusion that had benefited Marcus. While the legal pincer squeezed Marcus's finances, Elena prepared the public narrative. She knew that in their social circle infertility was pitted, but treachery and financial fraud were unforgivable sins. Elena did not go to the press directly. Instead, she contacted her closest, most discreet social confidant, a woman named Juliet, who also happened to be the wife of Ethelred Capital's senior and increasingly disgruntled managing partner. Elena met Juliet in a neutral, highly public location, a museum cafe, knowing their meeting would be observed and whispered about. Elena wore a simple, elegant dress, the picture of serene, recovered dignity. She didn't launch into accusations. She shared the sad, complicated story of the diagnosis, the shock of the second opinion, and the agonizing realization that her 7 years of grief had been a lie. It wasn't about having a baby, Juliet, Elena confided, leaning in close enough for the nearby patrons to strain to hear. It was about money. Marcus had to be eligible for that promotion, and they needed to make sure I couldn't have a child to get in the way of a family inheritance. The diagnosis was bought. She presented the genuine medical report, letting Juliet read the embossed letterhead. She made no mention of Victor or the syndicate. She framed the story as a simple, cruel narrative of old money betrayal. The moment Juliet left, the story began to spread like wildfire. Marcus's brilliant success was immediately tainted by the word fraud. People weren't questioning if he was guilty. They were questioning how he could be so cruel as to invent a tragedy to secure a promotion. The social shame was swift and brutal. The public narrative created the perfect opening. As the whispers turned into loud accusations, the board of Ethelred Capital called Marcus into an emergency session. Victor, knowing the exact moment of the meeting, had his people execute the final move. Through a series of complex, untraceable transactions, Victor simultaneously liquidated the assets that Marcus had been using as his private slush fund, and then used the publicly available court documents from Elena's lawsuit to suggest a massive compliance failure at Ethelred. During his meeting, Marcus was confronted not only with his recent capital infusion but also with the notarized affidavit admitting to the falsified diagnosis, which Victor had discreetly ensured was leaked into the board's private digital communication channel minutes before the session. The board didn't care about Elena's pain. They cared about the liability and the regulatory breach. The sight of the signed confession, complete with the clinic's letterhead, proved Marcus was not just a successful banker, but a conspirator in an illegal 7-year fraud that had now destabilized their stock and risked a major SEC investigation. Marcus was fired, not with fanfare but with the cold, absolute finality of a lock clicking shut. When Elena received the news, she was sitting alone in her wing watching the city lights. Victor appeared silently in her doorway. "He is neutralized," Victor confirmed. "Fired, his assets seized by the board to mitigate their liability, and facing criminal charges based on the documentation from the clinic. The social shame is irreversible. He is politically and finally sterile." Elena leaned her head back, not in relief but in cold satisfaction. She hadn't needed a weapon. She had needed intelligence, timing, and the ability to manipulate the narrative. She had turned Marcus's greatest weapon, his social standing and the power of the Maros name, against him. "He is gone but the threat remains," Elena observed, her voice low. "The Osman faction is still there. They will see that his exposure was orchestrated. Victor looked at her, and for the first time, Elena realized that his admiration was not just strategic. It was genuine. She had moved with the lethal, surgical precision of a true player. You orchestrated the entire downfall without ever revealing my involvement, your location, or the true purpose of your fertility, Victor conceded. You proved that social manipulation is far more effective than any brute force. You are not a liability, Elena. You are a force capable of reshaping the balance of power. With Marcus Maros neutralized and rendered invisible, the tactical objective was complete. The leverage had been successfully deployed, the Osman faction's first major move counteracted, and Elena's existence now served as a powerful deterrent against future attempts on the Petrov Trust. The atmosphere within Victor's estate shifted from one of high-stakes, ruthless strategy to a charged, uneasy silence. Elena was no longer confined to her wing, often spending her evenings in the tactical center or the library, not for work, but for the unspoken company of Victor. They would sit for hours, sometimes discussing the fallout of Marcus's exposure, other times simply reading, the vast silence of the house pressing around them. The bond that had formed between them was forged in the crucible of mutual necessity, but it had evolved into something far more dangerous than simple attraction: mutual respect. Elena respected Victor's surgical precision, his unshakable control, and his commitment to honoring their strict transactional contract. He respected her courage, her intellectual rigor, and her terrifying ability to leverage social and legal pressure points. They had seen each other at their most calculating and ruthless, stripped of the polite facades of their respective worlds. One evening, Elena was reviewing a brief on the succession accord in the library, the complex legal language blurring before her eyes. Victor was across the room, staring out the vast window at the city. "You have never once used the leverage you acquired on the street, Victor," Elena said quietly, breaking the silence. "You said the price was my silence and my cooperation. I gave you that. But you never made me feel controlled sexually or emotionally. Why? That is a power most men in your position would seize instantly." Victor turned, his severe profile softened by the low lamplight. "Control is an illusion, Elena. True power comes from anticipating consequences. Had I taken control sexually or personally, I would have eroded the very thing that made you valuable: your agency and your intellect. I needed your focus, not your submission. Submission is temporary, competence is permanent." "A very pragmatic answer," she conceded, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "But there is something beyond pragmatism now, isn't there?" The question hung between them, heavy and undeniable. They had moved beyond the sterile boundaries of their agreement. Their late-night discussions had begun to stray into personal territory, Victor reluctantly sharing glimpses of his own lonely, controlled upbringing under the syndicate, and Elena revealing the genuine, naive hope she had once held for her marriage. They were two people who lived their lives entirely within strategic, protective walls, and they had found a single fragile point of vulnerability in each other. "You saved me from despair," Elena admitted, looking up from the documents. "And I helped you secure your position. But if I stay here with you, this place becomes a different kind of prison. A warm one, a powerful one, but still a cage. I gain your power, but I risk losing the self I fought so hard to retrieve." Victor finally walked toward her, not with the intent of seduction but of confrontation. He stopped just across the table, his hands resting on the cool quartz. "You assume that to be with me is to lose yourself, Elena," he said, his voice low and intense. "You assume this world must consume you. But you are the woman who brought down a major financial player without ever firing a shot. If you stay, you do not become a consort. You become a co-architect of the very structures you seek to dismantle. You would gain access, protection, and the tools to wield genuine, irreversible power." This was the terrifying truth of their relationship. Love in their world was not a reward. It was an extreme high-stakes risk. Staying with Victor meant accepting a life defined by the brutal shadow rules of the syndicate. A life where comfort was paid for in moral compromises and eternal vigilance. Leaving meant sacrificing the only man who had ever truly seen her as powerful, and walking away from a future she had actively helped build. Their hands met accidentally on the quartz table, a jolt of connection that instantly blurred the line between contract and chemistry. It was a raw moment of shared realization. The mutual respect had blossomed into a profound, terrifying need. And what do you risk, Victor? Elena challenged, her gaze locked on his. If you let me stay, you introduce the only variable you cannot control into your life. An unpredictable, emotional factor. A liability. He didn't flinch. I risk losing the only person who has ever looked at my world and seen the strategy instead of the horror. I risk caring more about your safety than my success. Yes, you are a liability. But you are a necessary one. The moment reached its breaking point. Elena knew she had a choice. The life of power and risk or the life of freedom and isolation. Both futures were cold, but only one offered the warmth of earned partnership. Suddenly she pulled her hand away, the movement decisive and sharp. She stood up, walking away from the table, away from his gravitational pull. I cannot be possessed twice, Victor, she said, her voice shaking slightly but holding firm. Marcus tried to possess my body's function. You would possess my future's trajectory. The purpose of this entire exercise was to prove that I am not a pawn to be moved by powerful men. I cannot cement my freedom by walking directly into a new kind of ownership. She turned to face him, the finality etched on her face. I am leaving, she announced. I am walking away from the leverage, the protection, and the power. I have the truth about my fertility and the proof of Marcus's treachery. I have the foundation of my life back. If the syndicate wants me, they will have to find me. As an autonomous woman, not as your shield. Victor, for the first time since the rain-soaked street corner, showed a flicker of something truly vulnerable, a profound sense of loss. He remained perfectly still, a marble statue of control. The Osman faction will know you are gone within 72 hours, he warned, his voice a low gravel. They will see this not as an act of independence but as a reckless exposure. I cannot protect you if I do not know where you are. That is the decision I must make for myself, Elena replied, her resolve hardening. I did not demand agency just to hand it back to you. I took the chessboard, Victor, and now I am declaring a draw. A temporary one, perhaps, but a draw nonetheless. She walked toward the private exit that led to her old wing. Do you want me to arrange an exit? A new identity? Resources? Victor asked, the offer of aid now sounding like a final, desperate plea for control. No. Elena said simply. I walk out the same way I came in, with a suitcase, the clothes on my back, and the truth. That is all I need. She opened the door, preparing to walk away from the man who had shown her true power. She left him standing alone, a king abandoned by his most powerful piece. Elena had made a decision Victor could not control. She chose to risk freedom over secured power, proving in the ultimate sense that she was truly unclaimed. The dawn broke over the city. A cold, clear light that promised neither mercy nor comfort. It was a fitting backdrop for the final chapter of Elena's liberation. She stood in her immaculate temporary suite, looking at the small silver-handled suitcase, the same one Marcus had thrown out in the rain, and felt a profound sense of closure. This time she was packing nothing but clothes and the truth. The crumpled medical report confirming her fertility was tucked into the pocket of her coat, not as a banner of victory, but as a silent confirmation of her reclaimed reality. She had spent the night in quiet preparation, writing a single concise note to Victor, sealing it in an envelope and leaving it on the tactical table. I will define my own terms now. Thank you for the lessons. As the sun climbed higher, casting sharp angled shadows across the estate, Elena walked the familiar route to the main foyer. She moved with a confidence born not of power but of absolute agency. She was not running from Marcus's world or to Victor's. She was walking into her own. Victor was waiting for her in the foyer. He was dressed in his usual severe black attire, standing near the great front doors. His expression was the mask of controlled severity she had first encountered, but now she could read the subtle tension in his jaw, the hardness around his eyes that betrayed a rare, deep-seated defeat. The car is waiting, Victor said, his voice flat. He offered no further pleas, no threats, and no attempts to physically stop her. He was adhering to her decision, which was the final, devastating proof of his respect and his loss. I am walking, Elena corrected. I walked out of the Morrow's house alone and I will walk out of yours the same way. The only difference is, this time I know exactly what I am carrying. She paused before him, looking into the eyes that had seen her as a contract clause, then as a strategist, and finally as a woman worth risking his empire for. You taught me that power is leverage, she said, her voice gentle but firm. You gave me the truth about the lie they forced on me. You helped me destroy the prison they built. I cannot repay that by becoming a permanent fixture in your war. My survival cannot be contingent on your protection. Your survival will be very difficult now, Victor cautioned. You are unclaimed. You are outside the parameters of any agreement. The Osman faction will know that the key to the succession accord is vulnerable and unprotected. They will come for you. Then I will face them, Elena stated, pulling on her gloves. They tried to make me infertile to claim control. I am walking out as the woman who was never infertile, a woman who proved she is powerful enough to orchestrate the downfall of their proxy without even raising her voice. I am dangerous on my own terms, Victor. That is the truth they must now contend with. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out the crumpled, now smoothed medical report, and laid it on a small marble table near the door, a silent challenge to the empty house. That document is public record now through the lawsuit, she said. They can no longer claim my diagnosis was legitimate. The biological contract clause is active, and I am its independent executor. Victor finally moved. He took a single measured step toward her, his proximity a potent, almost overwhelming force. For a brief, agonizing moment, Elena thought he would try to compel her to stay, to seize the control he had so carefully relinquished. Instead, he simply reached out and ran the back of his finger along her jawline, a fleeting, almost painful gesture of farewell. Go, Elena Petrova, he commanded, the use of her maiden name a recognition of the true identity she had reclaimed. But know this, the greatest loss to my empire today is not territory or capital. It is the strategist I allowed to walk away. You changed the balance of power without ever firing a shot. Elena met his gaze, holding the unspoken truth of the relationship between them, the respect, the attraction, the impossible future, and then she took the final, most crucial step of her life. She turned her back on the formidable protection, the crushing power, and the complex, dangerous man who ran it all. She opened the great front doors and stepped out. She did not look back. She walked down the long, sweeping driveway, past the intricate security sensors she now understood, past the quiet perimeter, and through the main gate that had once seemed to close on a new prison. She reached the street where weeks ago she had been a broken, wet silhouette walking away from a shattered life. Now the sun was shining and she was a different woman entirely. She carried no anger for the past, only clarity for the future. Marcus's public ruin had given her justice. Victor's terrifying honesty had given her power. She reached the corner and paused, her lungs filling with the cold, free air. The story closes with Elena Petrova, standing alone. She is not rescued by a lover, nor is she broken by her enemies. She is unclaimed. The threat of the syndicate remains, the uncertainty of her future is absolute, but she holds the ultimate power, the freedom to define her own terms. The audience is left with the enduring question: who truly won? Victor had secured his succession by confirming her fertility, but Elena had secured her autonomy by refusing to be possessed. She was the leverage he needed, but by walking away she proved that the most powerful force in the world is not the threat of a syndicate, but the will of an unbound woman. She set the suitcase down, took a final deep breath, and began walking toward the city, toward a life she alone would build. We have come to the end of the story. Thank you for watching to the end. Share your opinion about this story in the comments below. I like getting feedback from my audience. Also, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our heartwarming stories.